Hello everybody, Mrs. Kipp back again from Syracuse Academy of Science and Citizenship with another lesson from our domain. Domain 10, A New Nation, American Independence. Today we are going to learn about George Washington, Commander-in-Chief. So our objectives for today are to describe how the 13 colonies in America evolved from dependence on Great Britain to independence as a nation, and to describe the contributions of George Washington as military commander. All right, let's get into it. Here's our first picture. You will remember that while representatives to the Second Continental Congress met and signed the Declaration of Independence, George Washington was far away from Philadelphia. He was sent north to Boston to fight the British. This was a very difficult job. George Washington's army was made up mostly of farmers with no military experience at all. They had no uniforms and only old guns called muskets, which they hardly knew how to fire. There weren't enough guns and there were hardly any gunpowder. The wording of the Declaration of Independence was approved on July 4th, 1776. 5 days later, messengers carrying copies of the Declaration reached New York, where General Washington's army was camped. His army heard the words and rallied in support of independence. A statue of King George was melted down into bullets for the Continental Army. Wow. That's a cool drawing. The men soon realized that they would never have enough bullets for the fight ahead. Later that summer, British warships were spotted entering New York's harbor. King George had gotten help from the Germans as well. Germans are people who are from Germany, another country on the continent of Europe. More than 30,000 trained troops arrived to fight the unprepared colonial militiamen. George Washington nearly lost his army in the fierce fighting around New York and New Jersey that fall. The Redcoats chased the Continental Army south across the Delaware River. Thinking that they had scared them off, the Redcoats left only a small force to guard them on the other side of the river. It was December, and they felt sure that nobody would fight during the dead of winter, but they were wrong. Yikes. These guys were very brave to be willing to fight an army coming that was well prepared, and they were not well prepared. They didn't have enough guns for everybody. Their guns were old. They didn't really know how to use them. They weren't trained to fight in an army. So they're very brave to be willing to do that. George Washington came up with a daring plan. Daring means courageous. On Christmas night, he gathered his men together. It was snowing and cold, but Washington had the men get into their boats and row quietly across the ice-filled river. More than 2,000 soldiers crossed the river. The crossings took 9 hours. Marching through the wind and sleet of the December cold, the Continental Army reached the British troops just before dawn. While the Redcoats were still sleeping, Washington's men launched a surprise attack on the enemy camp. The Redcoats were surprised, all right. Some of them came out of their bunks in their underwear and just held up their hands. It was a total victory for General Washington. Nobody in his army had been killed. Washington and his army returned to Philadelphia to shouts of joy, but the war wasn't over yet. The Continental Congress knew that they needed more help in order to win their war for independence. German soldiers were fighting alongside the British. Perhaps the French would send soldiers across the ocean to help the colonists fight against the British. It was no secret that the French and British had long been enemies. The Continental Congress decided to send some men to France to ask for their support. Their chief chief representative was 70-year-old Benjamin Franklin. The French did not like to lose in battle, and they were still angry about losing to the British in an earlier war. At first, they did not want to support the colonists. It was crazy to think that an army of farmers could defeat one of the greatest armies in the world, the British Army. But an American victory in New York in the fall of 1777 changed their opinion overnight. They promised gunpowder, soldiers, and ships, so they would be more prepared for battle. General Washington's army was camped in Pennsylvania at a place called Valley Forge during the winter of 1777 and 1778. Snow lay on the ground when Washington and his men arrived. They pitched tents and built log cabins, but neither kept out the cold. The men were dressed in rags, and many of them had no shoes, walking barefoot in the snow. Oh my gosh. There was hardly any food, and some days the men had little to eat and drink other than bread and water. Disease spread throughout the camp, and many men died. The men missed their families and wanted to go home. Washington struggled to keep up his men's spirits. So Washington worked very hard to keep his men from quitting. He camped in a tent beside them for a time, earning their respect. No battles were fought in Valley Forge that winter, but the cold and hungry men spent hours training to be ready when they met the British again in the spring. Wow. This is a long war, huh? That's it for today. Let's go over some questions. And that's it until next time. All right. Number 1. How would you describe George Washington as Commander-in-Chief? He was brave, for sure, and he was a good leader. Rich just said it was freezing. They were intense. It was the middle of winter. Some of them didn't have shoes or food. They were dressed in rags, and he camped out right there with them to earn their respect. Number 2. How would you describe George Washington's army? Remember, they had no military experience. They were not trained to be soldiers. These were farmers. These were just normal people that said we're willing to fight for our independence. And they had few supplies, like a good place to stay when it's cold out, or enough food, or the right clothes for how cold it was out. So they were very brave. All right, next one. How did the Declaration of Independence make George Washington's soldiers feel, and what did they do after they heard it? So after they heard the Declaration of Independence, how did it make them feel, and what did they do after they heard the Declaration of Independence? It made them want to fight for their independence, and they melted the statue of King George to use for bullets, and they started winning some battles. So, an important vocabulary word from today's lesson was the word struggled. In the read aloud, you heard Washington struggled to keep up his men's spirits. Struggled means had difficulty and worked very hard to accomplish something. I struggled to get up the steps with a heavy box. Have you ever struggled with a task? I know I have. I've definitely struggled to get up early in the morning sometimes when I'm still tired and I'm just feeling lazy and I want to stay in bed. What else? I've struggled with missing you guys so much, but I'm so glad I get to see your answers every day and your pictures and your videos you send me. That helps me not struggle so much, for sure. All right. I'm going to ask you some personal questions about things maybe you have or haven't struggled with. We can do our hand signals. Yes, you have struggled, or no, you have not struggled. Number 1. Have you ever struggled to get out of bed in the morning? I just said, yes, I sure have sometimes. Number 2, have you ever struggled with cleaning your room? Be honest. I have, especially when I have to put laundry away. I struggle with getting that done. Number 3, have you ever struggled to find something? Yep, my car keys, all the time. Number 4, have you ever struggled to wait your turn? Yep, I have. I've been on the struggle bus for all of those and even more. All right, guys, that's it for today. Our next lesson is called, Will This War Ever End? That's what I just said. This war is going on so long, and they're struggling. So I can't wait to hear, will this war ever end? I will see you next time. I miss you guys. Have a good night. Bye.